Good evening. This is Jim Werbenoth again. I'm back with a treatment of a battle that I've always found fascinating. And of course, as some of you are aware, many of you are aware, I have treated this an awful lot over the years. Most recently, 2 years ago at Origins for the Origins War College in Columbus, Ohio. I did a very similar presentation there, and I'd like to return to it here, put it on my own channel. And this one covers the Battle of Gazala, which proved to be Erwin Rommel's greatest victory, and it was the one that earned him his baton as a field marshal in the Wehrmacht, but it was also flawed as it turned out, and in some ways led to the defeat of Panzerarmee Afrika in 1943. So I'd like to go back and cover this. It's a favorite of mine, and so please sit back and enjoy. More than almost any other campaign in World War II, any other theater, there was a distinct ebb and flow in North Africa, where maneuver, advance, retreat, sometimes very quickly on both advancing and running away, were really par for the course. And interrupting this were periods in which both sides would reach a kind of stalemate and build up their forces for the next battle, the next campaign. And it was very distinctive flow, for different than what you see in Europe or the Eastern Front or any place. You might have had it in the Eastern Front or in France in 1940, but it was basically in one direction there and then another over large distances, large fronts. Here it's longer distances, shorter fronts. And in large part it's dictated by logistics. First of all, it's harder to maintain them in an arid environment like you see here in North Africa and Libya and Egypt. Secondly, both sides are dependent on supplies and replacements and new equipment being brought in to their main ports. For the Germans and Italians, it was Tripoli, which is off the map to the left. And for the British, it's Alexandria off the map to the east. These were really the centers of gravity, and whomever took the other side's major port was going to win. Until then, they would go back and forth across the arid coast and the desert of Cyrenaica, the eastern province of Libya you see here, and the western desert of Egypt. In this case, too, that the land itself became conducive to maneuver, but also really wasn't worth a whole lot. That you had some objectives like Benghazi, Darna, which is on the map here, up at the eastern part of Jebel Akhdar. And in Egypt, you had Alexandria, but not much in Egypt. But really the one that mattered in terms of morale and logistics and a combination was Tobruk. And Tobruk on the map here was held by the Australians after the first Axis offensive towards Egypt. Well, actually the first counteroffensive, because the British had defeated them in Operation Compass in late 1940. So you have a lot of land here without objectives, but plenty of room to fight. And they followed basically the same roads, or lack thereof. There was a lot of flanking and outflanking, especially in Operation Crusader, which was a very confused battle that the British won on the Egyptian-Libyan border. And the British were able to defeat Panzerarmee Afrika badly enough that they were forced out of Cyrenaica back to Alamein on the border between Cyrenaica and Tripolitania to the west off the map, which was really the starting point of the original Italian-German offensive under Rommel. And the Australians were relieved at Tobruk. Everything looks fine and happy for the British. They have driven their enemies back all the way to their starting point. Now, what happens here is that the British are distant from their supply lines, their supply centers, especially Alexandria. Everything is being driven up by truck from a distant railhead, and the Axis are able to recover and take the offensive from Alamein. And they are stopped just short of Tobruk, which the British hold on to, and they also hold a line down to Bir Hakeim, which is on the map southwest of Tobruk. So the Bir Hakeim was held by the French, and there's a line of defenses and minefields stretching from Bir Hakeim up to Tobruk. So let's look at the status as it was in May 1942. Let's look at the status of May of 1942. There's a general stalemate as both sides prepare for offensive operations. They've burned through their supplies. They're at roughly equal strength, neither one of which feels confidence enough to go on the attack. So there's a sort of stalemate, an equilibrium here between the Axis and the British Commonwealth. Now, Churchill has been continually pushing for the Eighth Army to attack. He wants to attack now, or yesterday would be even better. And he's stubbornly opposed by the commander in the area, Sir Claude Auchinleck, who had fought the earlier battles, including at Operation Crusader on the Libyan-Egyptian border, and the new commander of the Eighth Army, who was his chief of staff, Sir Neil Ritchie. They're continually being nagged by Churchill to go on the attack. Well, this is Churchill. He's also in London and may not fully understand what's going on in the deserts of North Africa. Now, nobody has to nag Erwin Rommel to go on the attack. This is his modus operandi. This is just what he does. And you could see it not just in 1941, but in 1940, when he commanded the 7th Panzer Division, sometimes called the Ghost Division, for the way it would just disappear. Neither the Allies nor his own command could be sure where it was going to pop up. And as a result, the 7th Panzer Division instituted an absolutely unprecedented hellbound charge across France, westward from the breakout on the Meuse, and really put on a clinic on Blitzkrieg. So what the British are doing here to prepare for the battle, besides amassing supplies for the offensive that Churchill wants, Auchinleck and Ritchie are laying a fortified mine southwards from just west of Tobruk, heading southwards to Bir Hakeim. And this is constructed largely of mines that were stripped from the defenses of Tobruk. These are Italian mines that the Italians had laid before the war. The British strip the minefields and repurpose them in a new area in this fortified line of minefields. Now, this is not a continuous line of fortifications. There are several boxes which are fortified, surrounded by minefields, and are capable of supporting a single infantry brigade. They're not really within supporting distance of each other, which is a problem, but they offer all-around defense. And these go down to Bir Hakeim, which is held by a Free French brigade, which includes the French Foreign Legion, with a lot of German members, by the way, communists, socialists, members of the international brigades who had fought in the Spanish Civil War. Guys you can bet are going to be especially determined, not just to defend the honor of France, but because they are Germans and have no wish to be captured by the Nazis. These are their blood enemies. They will be holding the furthermost fortified box at Bir Hakeim. And south of them, there's nothing but desert. It's an open flank. The British have made a decision. When they won Operation Crusader, they relieved a Australian division that was holding Tobruk as a thorn in the Axis side. They repulsed several German and Italian attacks to take the city. They held, but this was one more division that could not be in the line. And they have been withdrawn because the Australians are needed to fight in the Far East to defend Australia and New Guinea against the Japanese. So the 9th Australian Division has been pulled out of the theater. And the British are not going to go through this again. They have decided not to let Tobruk be besieged again. They would sooner abandon it to the enemy than put a garrison in there to be cut off and continually attacked. At least this is their plan. But this is the original decision that Auchinleck and Ritchie have come to. Let's look at the Axis leadership here, and it really centers on one guy, General-Lieutenant Erwin Rommel. He is the Desert Fox. He has amassed a real myth of invincibility by this point in France in 1940 and in Africa in 1941. This is a guy that many British look at and figure he can't be beaten, which is quite an accomplishment that he can partially demoralize the enemy just by his presence. He was defeated in Operation Crusader, but came back, really brought his army back from the dead to start a new offensive that took him right back almost to where he started at the beginning of Crusader. Now, his plan is termed Operation Venezia. And this is going to be an attack around the flank of the 8th Army at the Gazala line, that fortified line of minefields that the British had laid. And what he's going to use for this, besides a rebuilt Panzerarmee Afrika, including important contributions by Italian divisions, is that he's borrowing air power that had been used to support the Axis attacks on Malta, probably the most important piece of real estate anywhere in the Mediterranean. And it was being held back until now to support Operation Hercules, which was going to be the German-Italian airborne and amphibious operation to seize the island. My view, this would have won World War II in the Mediterranean at least, and made everything east of Malta really untenable for the British. Maybe not right away, but soon enough, because it would have cut off direct supplies through Gibraltar, through the Mediterranean to Alexandria. Any supplies, any reinforcement would have had to then go past South Africa, up the coast of East Africa, and the Red Sea to the Suez Canal. That is, if the British were able to hold on to the Suez Canal, the Nile, Cairo, Alexandria, we're looking at an absolute complete disaster in the Eastern Mediterranean here. That would have gone a long way towards winning World War II for the Axis. So Operation Hercules, the operation that didn't go through and which few people have heard of, was going to be a decisive blow in the Mediterranean. Rommel was able to convince his bosses that it wasn't going to be totally necessary because Axis air power had largely neutralized the island as a threat to Axis shipping. And he's partially correct here, that at this point, May 1942, it was very difficult for British air power to do more than defend the island, and it was more difficult for submarines to operate against the Italian convoys. So he may have had a point here, but it's still a fateful decision that Operation Venetia, Rommel's attack at Gazala and towards Tobruk, was going to take precedence over Operation Hercules, the seizure of Malta. Now, let's look at the British leadership. We start with General Sir Claude Auchinleck. He's one of my favorite British commanders of World War II. Not quite up there with Sir William Slim, later Lord Slim of Burma, but he's one of the better ones. And he is the overall commander for the Middle East and is responsible for a lot more than just this little section of North Africa. Consider Egypt, the League of Nations Mandate of Palestine, later Israel and Jordan and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. He's got a pretty wide area of responsibility, not just this one front of engagement with the Axis. So he's responsible for a whole lot. His service is mainly in the Indian Army rather than with British regiments. So he has a familiarity with, called exotic locales. He is not really hidebound to exercises on Salisbury Plain. And like most British officers, he's a linguist. He speaks Urdu very well. And this is really required of the British Indian Army because Urdu was a main language of command to the enlisted men. And British officers did not just yell, "Speak English, damn it," when they were in India. They learned to speak to the troops. And it's a valuable tradition you see even today with Gurkha soldiers. Their officers all speak Nepali. It's required. And many of these Indian officers, Indian Army officers, could speak maybe 3 Indian languages. So I would put the Indian officers as maybe a little more intellectual in that regard than the ones who were basically with British regiments. My own opinion is that sometimes exotic ideas could soak through better and they could be a little more flexible than their brothers coming out of Salisbury Plain in the European British establishment. In a lot of ways too, Auchinleck, he's the best of the Indian Army as I see it at least. He embodies all their strengths. Any weaknesses are strictly his own. And one of these weaknesses is the commander of the 8th Army. This is Sir Neil Ritchie. Auchinleck is a fine general. He's a visionary in some regards. I think he knows what it takes to win, including against the Germans in North Africa. Ritchie is not quite up there. Now, he takes over the 8th Army during Crusader when Auchinleck sensibly relieves its commander, Alan Cunningham, who was starting to show a failure of nerve on when he was really not that far from victory. And Auchinleck made a very good decision in cashiering Cunningham and putting Ritchie in there. Especially getting rid of Cunningham, that's a good idea. Ritchie, in the long run, maybe not so much. He was Assistant Chief of Staff and then Chief of Staff to Auchinleck. So he winds up having 2 hats, basically. And this is a little too much. I think this is a bad practice that we also see in Korea, with the United States Army when 10 Corps in Korea was commanded by Lieutenant General Ned Almond, who happened to be MacArthur's chief of staff. You can't do these two jobs. They're too important. They're too demanding. Something's going to give. So don't do that. But Auchinleck did it anyway, and he put Ritchie in charge of the 8th Army. And he retained command of the 8th Army even after he became chief of staff. This would have been a really good chance for Auchinleck to cement Ritchie's status as a field commander. Instead, he promoted him, gave him another hat, and put him in charge of the 8th Army all at the same time. Not a good idea, but he did it. And I think this was probably Auchinleck's biggest mistake. He should have had another chief of staff, and if you wanted Ritchie as chief of staff, get another guy to command the 8th Army, even though, shall we say, the bench of the British Army was a little shallow at this time. They didn't have a lot of alternatives, but still, I don't see this as a good move on his part. Now, let's look at Auchinleck's attempts to change 8th Army practices. They were re-equipping, but also changing the way they went about their business under Auchinleck. Part of the re-equipment you see on the right side is an American Stuart light tank, which was developed in the United States as a scout vehicle, but sent to Britain large numbers under Lend-Lease, where it worked as a main battle tank. And the British gave it the name Honey. They liked it. Russians, not so much. But the British liked it, so his army is benefiting from some new equipment, and especially best practices. First of all, Auchinleck puts a greater emphasis on combined arms. Not tanks fighting tanks, but tanks, infantry, artillery, air power, especially that first three, the holy trinity of combat arms: armor, infantry, artillery, fighting together and becoming more than the sum of their parts. This is something the Germans pioneered, and the Soviets too, before World War II, under Mikhail Tukhachevsky, before he was purged. Combined arms are vitally important, and Britain and France were a little slow to pick up the idea here. But Auchinleck is learning. He can learn from experience, from the defeats as well as the victories. In order to increase this, he increases the amount of infantry and armored divisions. Previously, in 1940, you see, like French armored divisions might have 1 battalion of infantry and everything else being tanks. The United States by 1944 typically is even up. 1 battalion of armor operating with a battalion of armored infantry operating with a battalion of artillery and a combat command. 1941, this is kind of novel, but Auchinleck is getting the idea of balancing his divisions by increasing the amount of infantry that is there to support the armor. And the armor is there to support the infantry, and the artillery is there to give some measure of dignity to what would otherwise be a common brawl. These three have to operate together. For example, tanks run into anti-tank units. These small, concealed anti-tank guns. Tanks can't engage them. The gunners and the commanders can't see very well, and the target is distant. It's hidden. Their best move is to call in artillery to suppress or destroy them. Now, in order to call in the artillery, because their vision is so bad, the tankers need infantry that can operate with the tanks, call in the artillery, and then move up and take and hold the position with armored support. So they're all supporting each other. And you need more armored infantry or more mechanized infantry with your armor in order to do this. The Germans have figured it out early. The Soviets figured it out and then forgot it when they purged Tukhachovsky. And the Americans have figured it out too, but they're not in the war in a big way yet. So increasing the infantry and the armored divisions is vitally important to the 8th Army, and Auchinleck starts that in motion. Concurrent with this, he wants to avoid piecemeal force commitments and tactics. That previously you would have small forces operating together, maybe battalion level. Maybe they might be combined arms, generally they wouldn't be. But this was sufficient when facing, say, the Italians in Operation Compass in late 1940. When they weren't the best army in the world, they weren't the best deployed, and they had a tendency to put their infantry into fortified positions that were not within supporting distance of each other. So small forces there could initiate battle and then pursue very, very well, very effectively. But here you're facing Italians as well as Germans, and the Germans are going to be the ones out front. They don't put up with that. And this piecemeal stuff that might have worked, say, in a punitive expedition out of India and Afghanistan or maybe in Iraq, this isn't going to work against a world-class army like the Wehrmacht. So Auchinleck wants to move away from this and emphasize concentration and mass. This is what the Germans do. They attack in terms of usually divisions. If the division separates, it's to operate separately but in a coordinated manner. Nobody is going out there by themselves. You're not going to have some little force running around the desert or running around France, completely independent and getting itself into trouble. You go with concentration and mass, just like Clausewitz intended. That you try to put as much firepower and numbers into one armored fist as you possibly can and run with that instead of little niggly gnat attacks, we used to call them in our old wargaming group. These little tiny gnat attacks that are just going to be irritating at best. So you concentrate. You not only use combined arms, you use lots of it in one place. And this is definitely reminiscent of the Axis best practices. What the British had witnessed and what they had fought in Africa and in France in 1940. They've seen the lesson plan. Rommel provided it. So did his colleagues in the Blitzkrieg in the West. And the British are adapting, and Auchinleck is driving that adaptation. But as we'll see, it's not always successful. So we'll take a look at the map of the right here from the Esposito series, series of histories and atlases developed for West Point West Point U.S. Military Academy cadets. I think these are some of the clearest maps you're going to see on just about any battle in World War II, but they work really well for Gazala. First phase, Rommel strikes. There's a diversion in the north by the Italians under a German general. This is Gruppa Crevell on the 26th of May, 1942. This is sort of an abortive, not quite effective diversion. And the main thing here is that the Italians are actually too aggressive. They advance too far. They take what is basically a fake, turn it into something more aggressive. And a lot of them get captured when the British, rather imaginatively, drop artillery behind them and cut off their retreat. Good use of firepower there. This starts on the 26th of May. And by the way, General Crevell ends up being captured. There's also an abortive landing on the Mediterranean behind Gazala and behind the Gazala line by Gruppe Hecker. And this is something that only became really publicized in maybe the last 40 years. This was a combined arms, but not, well, no artillery, no mechanized forces, but combined infantry and engineers who were going to set up a fortified position on the Mediterranean coast behind these boxes you see at the very top in the north, and basically provide a diversion to themselves and something that could interdict, maybe panic the British Commonwealth forces in the north, and it didn't go through. I think it was sort of a dumb idea. Maybe again a little too aggressive. That would have been vulnerable, and really for no real purpose. But Gruppe Hecker does not launch its amphibious attack in its bite and hold mission. Now, the main body of Panzerarmee Afrika, which is going to be the Afrika Corps and two Italian divisions, the Ariete Armored Division and Trento Mechanized Division, are going to sweep way to the south. They're going to do this big grand end around to the south of the Gazala line. And as they're doing this, they run into some surprises, and they're not pleasant for Rommel and his troops. First of all, the Gazala line goes a lot further south than they expected, and this is a failure of intelligence. And I know some historians, like Michael Citino, have pointed that intelligence is not a traditional German strength to this point, really going back to the 18th century. They're so focused on operations that they sometimes neglect intelligence. And here's a good case of it, that they don't realize how far south this line goes. Second, they run into Bir Hakeim. This is a fortified box held by the Free French, many of them actually German refugees in the Foreign Legion. They're not going to cut and run the first time they see a panzer. They're going to hold, and they're going to hold as long as they possibly can and not get captured. They also ran into unexpected British deployments, including units behind the Gazala line. Again, intelligence failure. They don't know where the British are. They have a very bad idea of this. Then there is the technological surprise of running into Lend-Lease Grant tanks. Now, the Grant tank has a bad reputation. It didn't do real well with the Americans as the lead tank in Tunisia and Algeria. It was which followed this battle. It was a stopgap until the Sherman could be deployed. And it's still, at this point, one of the best tanks in the desert. It's one that the Germans did not expect, has capabilities that they were not prepared for. It's got a high profile, which is bad. On the good side, it has a 75 millimeter gun when the Germans are armed almost entirely up to a 50 millimeter gun. Granted, it's not a high velocity gun, but it's bigger. It has more power. It fires large, high explosive rounds, which are good against infantry. But it's mounted on the sponson in the side of the hull, so it's got a very limited traverse compared to a turret-mounted gun. But wait, there's more. The Grant has a turret, and it has a 37 millimeter gun, which is actually superior to the British 2-pounder. Again, it's high velocity and can fire a high explosive round. So this is a tank that is just loaded full of firepower, and the Germans do not expect it. So they've got self-inflicted surprise when it comes to lack of intelligence, and they have technological surprise by the appearance of the M3 Grant tank. Not the best, but it's the best there is right now. Phase 2 is a position that was referred to as the cauldron. On the right here, we have a typical German Mark III Panzerkampfwagen 3 medium tank with its short 50 millimeter gun. This is typical of the German tank weapons at this time. Their main armament was the short 50 millimeter gun. They did have a few that had been upgraded to a longer 50 millimeter gun with a higher velocity and greater range. But generally, they've got this rather inferior weapon. Well, inferior to what they needed, and definitely inferior to the American 37 and 75 millimeter guns on the Grant. So they're going in with a bit of a handicap here. But these are the tanks that really carried the load for the Germans at Gazala. Now, Rommel pulls into the cauldron. His lines of communication have been partially cut. He's cut off, but he doesn't have the freedom of movement that he did with the Ghost Division 2 years earlier. He's also run into the French at Bir Hakeim, who are interdicting his supply lines around the flank. They're not just sitting there and doing nothing. They've got a more active defense. And this is a case, too, where the French do a lot to restore the pride and the honor of their country by effective defense and interdiction out of Bir Hakeim. And by the way, this is commemorated in Paris today by one of the newer bridges across the Seine, which is Le Pont Bir Hakeim, to memorialize what this brigade did. So they are not just impeding the German advance, they are cutting their supplies. Now, the minefields also cut Rommel's supplies, and the 150th Brigade of the British Army is to the rear of Afrika Korps and those two Italian mechanized divisions. So he's in a bad way. He's cornered, and he can't do what Rommel does and what he does best, which is to maneuver, hit flanks, surprise the enemy. He's got all the problems of being cut off with none of the benefits he enjoyed 2 years earlier with the Ghost Division. Now, in order to cope with this, his engineers start cutting gaps through the mines. And this is actually aided by a very poor British deployment. None of these fortified boxes to the south of Gazala are really in supporting range of each other. It's the same mistake the Italians made in Egypt in 1940 of fortifying positions where they're basically on their own. Now, with minefields can be very effective if they're covered by fire. If they're not covered by fire, artillery, infantry fire, machine guns, then the engineers can work more at their leisure and in some measure of safety, threatened only by the mines, in which case they can protect themselves by not stepping on them. But they can clear mines a lot easier than they can in the presence of the enemy. And this is what Rommel's engineers do. They start cutting holes through the minefields behind the Afrika Korps, Trento, and Ariete in order to get supplies through. They start this right away. Now, Rommel also, once he gets more supplies coming in, he starts attacking the 150th Brigade to the west of him. They cut through the minefields into the box and concentrate all their power that they can muster against a single British brigade. And it is destroyed between the 30th of May and the 1st of June. So this takes a big headache away from the Axis. And this is a decisive event because now Rommel is no longer boxed in. This is always going to be his milieu when he has some freedom of movement and maneuver. And now he has a much better supply logistical situation. He can be resupplied. And this creates problems for the other guys. Now, the British are supposed to launch a coordinated attack on the Cauldron, Operation Aberdeen. And it comes across piecemeal. Remember what Auchinleck was preaching about, the tendencies he was trying to eliminate in 8th Army. They do again. They fall back into their old habits. And as a result, Operation Aberdeen fails on the 5th of June. And this is immediately followed by an Axis counterattack out of the Cauldron. Phase 3 is a breakout into the rear of the 8th Army. Now, the Germans launch a major attack on Bir Hakeim on the 10th of June. The Italians had tried, they couldn't do it. The Germans do, and Bir Hakeim falls. But it has accomplished its purpose to this point. Now, subsequent attacks by Panzerarmee Afrika on the Knightsbridge position defeat the 201st Guards Brigade. The Germans are stalled, but there are massive losses on the British armor. Again, they are not fighting as well as maybe Auchinleck wanted them to. They still go in penny packets. They still think of themselves more as tank-on-tank battles. This is what they're fighting. They're not thinking as much in combined arms maybe as they should. But they end up suffering massive losses. And at this point, the momentum thoroughly shifts to the hands of the Axis. The best chance to defeat Rommel was in the Cauldron. Ritchie and 8th Army failed. Now they have to reap the bitter fruits of that failure. And the 8th Army goes on to be on the verge of total collapse. And on the 14th of June, they begin a general retreat from the Gazala line to the west of Tobruk, and they start falling back towards the Egyptian border. Now, the fourth phase, the fall of Tobruk, is one that is both demoralizing and embittering and embarrassing for Churchill, especially as he had played up the Australian defense the year before, and when Tobruk falls, he's in the most embarrassing position he can think of. He's at the White House conferring with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So he has handed the news of this defeat to and then has to pass it on to the President of the United States. One of the reasons why it fell is that its fortifications were in bad shape. They had been damaged by the siege the year before, and especially the minefields have been stripped for the Gazala line. This was a case of really good improvisation by the British, and improvisation and British Army are two terms that at this point probably shouldn't be used a lot together, but they do it. And they have stripped the fortifications of many of their mines that had been laid by the Italians and put them to another use. That's good, but now they're getting some of the ill effects. Tobruk itself is defended primarily by a couple of South African brigades. Now, the South Africans were good. I'm not going to say that they were complete suckitude or anything, but they're not the Australians. The Australians were really, I would put in terms of troop quality, unit quality, a level above the South Africans. And this led to a great rivalry between the two countries. But South Africa did not have the capabilities, it seems, on the battlefield as the Australians did. And it sort of comes through with the fall of Tobruk. And Auchinleck had already decided not to allow for another siege. He wasn't going to basically chase bad money with good money and lose too many troops and have this distraction. That he had tried to push through the decision not to defend Tobruk. But here we are. Tobruk is defended, and not in a way that is going to favor the British or the Commonwealth. So the Germans and Italians attack, and Tobruk surrenders on the 21st of June while Churchill is conferring with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And it turns out to be massively embarrassing for the Prime Minister. And at this point, too, the Axis pursue what's left of the 8th Army into Egypt. And this is a process that eventually ends at El Alamein, where the British firm up their defense. The Germans are depleted, too far from their supply sources in order to launch a fully effective attack. And they settle down into another stalemate. But that is at El Alamein. And there both sides start to rebuild. Now, we're going to look at some of the reasons for the British failure. But first, let's look at the weapon system on the right side. That is an M3 Grant. You can see the 75 millimeter gun in the right-hand side of the hull. Also, the turret with the 37 millimeter gun. The very high profile, which between that and the position, the 75 millimeter gun, made it very difficult for them to go into hull down positions. Something that tankers really favor because it allows the terrain to provide extra protection. They can't do it. But it's regarded as a stopgap by the Americans. It's regarded as a grave for seven brothers by the Soviets. But it's the best tank on the field at Gazala, especially for the Allied side. The upgunned Panzerarmee Afrika Model J with the long 50 millimeter gun. That's the best the Germans have, but they have very, very few of them. This is the queen of the battlefield, but it's kind of a messed up queen, if you will. This is a reason why maybe the British should have won, but there were a lot of reasons, and much stronger why they shouldn't have and why they didn't win. First of all, they failed to maintain the initiative. When they should have been moving, they should have been attacking, they were sitting back. This is not what you do with Erwin Rommel. He will take advantage of your inaction. He will get inside your decision cycle. And in fact, I'd say the entire German army at this point were pros at this. Even a lesser commander than Rommel would have been able to take advantage of the British inaction and the abdication of the initiative to the enemy. Bad idea under any circumstances, fatal when you're facing Rommel. Coupled with this is that the Commonwealth forces lacked a decisive killer instinct. They've got Rommel right where they want him, and they don't put him out of his misery or out of theirs. So they're there for the kill, and they can't put the harpoon in, if you will. That sort of killer instinct just isn't there. Also, to their bad deployment, they spread their brigade boxes too far apart. They can't support each other. Each brigade has to defend on its own without help from its neighbors. So each one of these brigades is in an unfortunate state of independence and vulnerability to massed Axis attacks. Also, too, the British have inferior tanks, except for the M3. The Stuart is good, but it's a reconnaissance tank. They rely largely on the Crusader, which had been introduced for Operation Crusader the year before. And in my humble opinion, it's a piece of garbage. Lightly armored. The 2-pounder gun is very well made, but it can't fire high explosives against infantry. In fact, that's a common flaw of all the British manufactured tanks at the time. It breaks down a lot. It's unreliable. in its favor, it's fast. But speed doesn't matter if you're on the back of the tow truck. And the Crusader certainly was. I think it's really a dead end of tank evolution. And the British intended to use it as a cavalry tank, basically taking over from the horse for reconnaissance, pursuit, anything where you needed speed. But it ended up having to actually fight the enemy, which is something that tanks are really supposed to do, and it didn't do very well. The Matilda tank was the Mark II was armed similarly with a 2-pounder gun, armed identically actually to the Crusader, but it was much slower. It had armor that was very difficult to penetrate. It was the best protected tank on the battlefield, but it was also slow as tar and also not really mechanically reliable. But there aren't that many of them. The Germans have more balanced tanks, combining speed, protection, mobility, and firepower. And of course, as a lot of historians will remind you, the Germans were the first ones to have a radio in every tank. So they've got much better command and control with good officers too, good leaders. So the basic technological quality of the German armor is superb. The British are trying to catch up, but they're not there. And I don't think that their skill level is quite as good among their crews and especially their commanders, which goes to the lack of killer instinct and the lack of ability to maintain the initiative. Also, too, part of this is that they lack fire to cover minefields. Let's go back to those brigades. They're on their own. They also can't cover the minefields very well with artillery or automatic weapons. There's not a whole lot they can do if the Germans and Italians decide to send their engineers out to dig up mines. So that lack of cover is decisive. And that really, really hurts when Rommel cuts through the minefields in order to resupply Afrika Korps. And I think this is the overwhelming primary reason. And this is something that Auchinleck preached against, but he didn't quite get through. The Axis thought of divisions as the primary maneuver units. They thought big. Let's move this division around. Let's combine divisions up. Let's combine divisions to make an attack. They're thinking in terms of large units and what they could do together in terms of mass and concentration. The British are still thinking in terms of smaller units. At Gazala, it was brigades. And you can't really oppose a division with a brigade. The division is at least 3 times bigger. It's harder to coordinate them, too. The British are still thinking small in terms of their units. The Axis are characteristically thinking big. But the British still haven't gotten around to Auchinleck's way of thinking, and it shows, and they pay for it. Let's look at the consequences for the British here. For Auchinleck and Ritchie, they're bad. They're fired. Churchill cashiers them both. And Strafer Gott is promoted to take over 8th Army. He is already in North Africa, commanding 13 Corps, but before he can do very much, he's killed in the air by the Luftwaffe, and he in turn is replaced by Bernard Law Montgomery. Montgomery is regarded as one of the greatest British generals of all time, especially in World War II, especially in the mind of Bernard Law Montgomery. I think he's very capable, especially at set-piece battles. He does not play well with others. He has no tact. His later chief of staff, General Freddie de Guingen, spent a lot of time apologizing to him, especially when he was subordinated to Dwight David Eisenhower, who famously said to Montgomery one time, "Monty, remember, I'm your boss." Montgomery was not good at playing with others. He lacked any sort of diplomacy. When it came to coalition warfare, he was no Wellington. He was no Slim. But he was also conscious of Britain's manpower limitations, the fact they were running out of soldiers pretty early, and he couldn't afford to waste troops in anything futile or anything costly. In some ways, I see him as the man of the moment for Britain, but at the same time, rather problematic. And his greatest moment, though, will come in North Africa at Alamein. And part of Churchill himself, he is just devastated. And he's in the White House when Tobruk falls. He can't hide his sorrow and his disappointment from Roosevelt. And in the long run, I think that this is actually beneficial to Britain and the Allies. Because what happens is Roosevelt diverts more American armor, especially M4 Shermans, to the 8th Army. You see a Lend-Lease Sherman on the right side here on a tank carrier, basically a flatbed to save the treads over long distance strategic movement. The Sherman becomes the best tank in the desert until the Tiger shows up, and they're in very small numbers in Tunisia. But they are a decisive element at El Alamein, along with Montgomery's very appropriate set-piece tactics. But the Germans no longer have a major technological superiority over the British in North Africa when the Shermans show up in large numbers. And Roosevelt sees a sense of urgency here too. The British need the Shermans now. The American army needs them down the road. So he strips them from American units to send to the British now. Excuse me. He fully appreciates the plight of the 8th Army and the plight of the British in North Africa. And I think that seeing Churchill so broken up has a lot to do with this, as well as really rational calculations of power, strength, and strategy. But these tanks get to Egypt and are able to fight El Alamein and beyond. Now, there are two battles of El Alamein. The first one is sort of a forlorn hope, a desperate throw of the dice by Rommel, which doesn't work. Second one is Montgomery's counterattack with those brand new Shermans, among other things. And this is decisive because it's the end of the war in North Africa as we know it. Rommel will be defeated. Hitler will tell him to stay in place, fight for every inch of ground, as Hitler will do. Rommel ends up having to retreat. Well, actually, he's in Germany for part of this too. He's recovering from any of the diseases you can pick up in Africa, and he comes back in time to fight El Alamein, but he is defeated. He's pursued by Montgomery and the 8th Army, not really energetically, because remember, Monty's cautious. At the same time that Americans and Brits are they have landed in North Africa, in far to the west, in Algeria and Morocco, fought the French, got them onto the Allied side, and they are driving on Tunisia, where Rommel ends up holding up, and along with the 10th Army, which has been sent from Europe, and the Axis are decisively defeated there. And a surrender that is really as bad as Stalingrad in terms of numbers. The Axis cannot afford this sort of loss that they suffer in Tunisia. But it all really starts at El Alamein, and I gotta give Monty his props for fighting the right battle in Egypt at the very end of the war in North Africa. So it's really come to a bad end for Rommel after Gazala. In some ways, it's bad for the Germans, despite being very confident after this major victory. But as we'll see, the future looks really bright for them, even though it maybe isn't. Here we have the consequences for the Axis. One of which is Rommel on the right here, shaking hands with the leader that he never turned on, despite what others might say. He was very, very Führertreue, if you will. He was loyal to Hitler, saw him as a legitimate head of state surrounded by some idiots. He was repulsed by things that went on in the regime, but he never could bring himself to turn against Hitler, despite being implicated in the 1944 general's plot. This is still up for debate, but you can see the pride in his face here, because not only is he meeting with his Führer, he's being promoted to Generalfeldmarschall. He is now a field marshal in the German army. He gets his baton. He's top of the bill now. He is got the best rank you can possibly get in the German army. He's honored for the victory at Gazala. And he is the youngest field marshal, too, in the German army. Now, he also obtained all those air assets lent to him for Gazala, Operation Venezia. He kept them. He did not give them back. Bad move, because this forestalls the possibility of taking out Malta once and for all. Had he released them, maybe they could have invaded Malta. Definitely, he did not release them, and the Germans and Italians never did land on Malta. And this was part of a bad habit that he had of appropriating Luftwaffe assets for himself. That one of his bad habits especially was to fuel his advances, which could be quite fast across the desert, including after Gazala. He would appropriate the Luftwaffe's trucks. He was very good about appropriating British trucks when he could capture them, but that would be fine, except that taking the Luftwaffe's trucks prevented them from redeploying forward enough, fast enough to support his ground troops. So in his own way, Rommel could not play well with others, especially with their toys. And he kept it up after Gazala. And eventually the Germans did take the aircraft back in the air units, but it was really too late by that point. They canceled Operation Hercules. And while Panzerarmee Afrika won at Gazala and captured Tobruk, Malta remained with the British. This is the most important piece of real estate in the Mediterranean. They held it. All the while, the Germans and the Italians are winning bigly in North Africa. They're losing bigly at sea and at Malta, because Malta never does fall. So in this way, it's one of those victories, kind of like Pearl Harbor, that immediately looks like a major win. You can celebrate till the cows come home, but it leads to a bigger defeat. It's a definition of a Pyrrhic victory, really. And after this, it's really bad news for the Axis in North Africa until they surrender in 43 in Tunisia. It's the end. And it's really decided at El Alamein, which is set up by the victory at Gazala. So this, I consider it a really flawed victory. But Rommel makes his reputation. He gets his field marshal's baton, and he goes on to a really important command later, which is Normandy. He is commanding the German defenses at Normandy until he is in a car that's strafed by the RAF, and he's sent back to Germany to recover from a fractured skull, among other wounds, where he is implicated in the general's plot and forced to commit suicide, where the Nazis, being the hypocrites that they are, staged a great sad state funeral for him, after especially his family knew that he had been forced to take his own life, but we're so sad. So it doesn't end well for anybody on the Axis side, I believe. And this is the pinnacle of Rommel's success after Gazala. But you know, when you reach the peak, the only place you can go is down. And he and the Germans did. Now let's look at the fun part here. I'm going to recommend some games for you. First one is Rommel at Gazala. This is a very simple game. It was designed as a project to show that any idiot could design a game. That like I said, it's simple, it's basic, I think it's fun. You can play 2 or 3 games in an evening, and the idiot who designed it was me. So this is available from Lock and Load. I originally self-published it myself as a download, but Lock and Load and their people did a really terrific job of developing it and creating some outstanding art. Highly recommended, but then again, I'm partial. For a more advanced look, there's Triumphant Fox. This was designed by Dirk Blenneman, a German Bundeswehr officer, now retired. This was designed for moments in history. And this is a much more sophisticated, I'll say advanced game that includes Kampfgruppe Hecker in there. It's a very fluid design where you don't have a specific time frame for turns. It's impulse based, so a lot can happen in a short time, or not much can happen over a long time. And you can't really line up turns with specific days or barely even weeks. But it's a very, very sophisticated operational simulation of the battle, like mine, similar scale, but I'm going to say it's much more advanced, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I did not do the definitive Gazala game. Triumphant Fox has more of a claim on that. Mine was started off as a clinic on designing games and to show people that if they're afraid to do it, if they don't think they can design a game, they're probably wrong. Or at least possibly wrong. Triumphant Fox is more of an achievement, I'd say, than mine. And I'm not real humble, but I gotta give credit where credit is due. Now the third one, Tobruk. This goes way back about 50 years. This is a tactical game based on miniatures, individual infantry squads, and individual tanks with basically unlimited stacking on a map with absolutely no features, where it's so detailed that you calculate the penetration and damage inflicted by each individual shell. Yeah. But it's one that we all grew up with in the 70s. And it was eventually superseded by the advanced squad leader system and the West of Alamein module, now replaced by for King and Country. But Tobruk was the longtime king of the Gazala tactical games. And most of us gamers of our generation, we played it to absolute death. And I still think it's fun. And I've covered it. In fact, I've covered all 3 in Line of Departure and the print edition. But Tobruk is one that I think holds a very special place in wargaming history for the amount of time that we played it and also the extreme level of detail. The only detail that really isn't in it are tank turrets, which is a little surprising, but there we are. Still, these are 3 that I can recommend, each in their own way. And for Tobruk, it's been superseded, but you can look at it as not just an instance of simulating history, but it is an important title in wargaming's own history. But by mine's cool. Now look at some of the references here, the resources that I use for research. Of course, we've got Winston Churchill at the very top, and not just because it's in alphabetical order. I don't see how you can deal with anything in World War II without looking to Churchill. Second is Robert Ayler's The Mediterranean Air War, Air Power and Allied Victory in World War II. This is an essential definitive text when it comes to Axis and Allied air operations, including detail about Rommel's hijacking of the Luftwaffe trucks and the misallocation of air power to Gazala that should have been used against Malta. The Osprey book by Ken Ford. Ospreys are very good overviews, kind of like an old-time strategy and tactics on one battle. And there are very few now that I would say you can go wrong with. The late Jack Green wrote Mare Nostrum, The War in the Mediterranean, which focuses largely on the Italians and does present Kampfgruppe Hecker. Jack and his friend Alessandro Massanini wrote Rommel's North Africa campaign. That is largely Italian-centered and uses Italian official histories as sources. Thomas E. Grice, The Second World War, Europe and the Mediterranean. This is from the West Point Military History Series, and the maps that you see in here are drawn from that. This goes back a ways to 1989, but it's an oldie but goodie. Then we get David Irving, The Trail of the Fox, which is a biography of Erwin Rommel. Let me say something about David Irving. He's a fine historian. He's a very good writer. His command of German is virtually of a native level. He does good research in archives. But as I said in the original first self-published edition of Rommel Gazala, if he came to my front door, I'd kick him on. I'd kick his ass. Guy's a total son of a bitch, Holocaust denying, Hitler loving. In his own words, moderate fascist. And I was actually tempted to take the book off the bibliography, but I did use it. I like Trail of the Fox. I think it's some of his best, least Nazi-contaminated work. It's one of these things where I use the book, but cannot stand the author. And the less said about him, the better, I think, in the long run. And I'm actually tempted on doing a whole video on David Irving and the problems and benefits of using his work. The one after that is by Major General F.W. I'm still thinking of Irving. F.W. von Mellenten, Panzer Battles. He wrote this as a retired Nazi officer in South Africa. In some ways, he's not real dependable when it comes to the Eastern Front. He's an excuse maker, and he has his Nazi bias. But it's worth consulting. The next one is an article on strategy and tactics. Al Nofi's The Desert Fox, Rommel's campaign in North Africa. He's not a Nazi. Al is very committed, progressive. He's very true to some high ideals. He's also a fine historian, and I'd say one of the best wargame designers from the SPI generation, and I still love his Imperium Romanum. He also got me involved in the New York Military Affairs Symposium, and I went to Manhattan at his behest and invitation in 2012 to present a paper on British strategy in the War of 1812. I've got some wide interests. And he also introduced me to grappa, a new form of alcohol, which even being half Irish, I had not heard of. And believe me, for the Irish not to hear of a form of alcohol, that's really something. But he introduced me to grappa, and I owe Al a favor for that. Ryan Parrott, Desert Warfare. This is a military book club title that I got many years ago. That's a very good overview of the war in the desert in North Africa, as well as World War I involving Lawrence of Arabia and the campaign into Palestine and Syria. It's a workmanlike book that I'm still glad I got it, but it's been superseded by a lot of things. Now, the last three are really essential reading because they're by me. I wrote an article for Avalanche Press for the daily content on the Matilda tank, the Flawed Queen of the Battlefield, a technical view of that. Another one on the M3 Grant, the wrong tank in the right place. That I drew a lot of the material on the Grant for this presentation from that Avalanche Press article. And there's also the battle manual for Rommel and Gazala. That was a magazine article that I wrote that didn't wind up in the magazine, so I incorporated it into the first edition of my game. So there's a lot of work there and a lot of works worth considering. Some that you may like the author, some you may want to join me in kicking him kick his ass off the front porch. Maybe this will get you thinking. If you're looking for a source, here's some places to start. Churchill, of course, then all the others. And I know it may be a little problematic at this point to invoke Jack Green, but I have to say that he was a very good friend of mine and very good historian when it came to all things Italian, naval game designer, and how he came to his end. I will not go into that, but I still remember him more as a friend than anything else. So I can highly recommend his works as well. So I'd like to thank you for your time. We've been at this for an hour and 16 minutes, and I'll let you go back to whatever you've been doing. And thank you for tuning into the latest from the Line of Departure channel. Thanks again, and have a pleasant evening or whatever time of day it is, wherever you're at.